I love artsy fartsy bullshit. It's something that I've discovered about myself, especially in the last few years or so. Pieces of art that don't necessarily have a straightforward story or an immediately understandable point or reason. Art that gives off an atmosphere and stylistic immersion are becoming more and more akin to my taste. In the world of film and movies, I am still dipping my toes into that world, but to give an example, one of my favorite horror movies is I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House. It's a slow burn film about death and the inevitability of it, and what power we may or may not have over it. I loved it, and it scared the living shit out of me, but as a certain hack fraud would put it...
Okay, yeah, it's pretty close.
I really liked it, and I can't recommend it to anybody because it's boring as fuck, but...
If someone wanted to cheap shot my taste and whittle it down to a catchphrase that is so common that you could probably put it on a t-shirt and sell it, you would say, I like style over substance. But I would argue in many of these instances that the style is part of the substance and what makes it engaging and fun to experience. Do you think that the movie A Scanner Darkly would be nearly as good if it ditched the cel-shaded style? Do you think that The Lighthouse would be nearly as effective if it just went with a standard screen ratio, and it even ditched the black and white color palette to adopt a normal one? These are just some basic bitch examples of what I mean, but I would argue that the answer to both of these would be a resounding no! Enter the realm of video games. An art form that is dictated by player control and human interaction. The only form of art that can tell you no in the most pure and direct form that is currently possible. Whereas movies used to be one of the most inclusive and diverse forms of art because it takes virtually all forms of art into one, such as like music, framing, performance, and more into one congealed meal for the senses. Video games add mechanics and interactivity. This makes the art form even more incredible and all-inclusive. For a long time, video games were more or less, and for ease of getting my point across, relatively samey. There were respective genres, of course, such as with any art form, but in those respective genres, the style and mechanics never strayed too far off from what each genre classified themselves under. Auteurs in video games in the days leading up to maybe the real explosion of like indie devs in the late 2000s were incredibly rare and hard to come across. The most well-known were probably Shigeru Miyamoto from Nintendo, Hideo Kojima of the Metal Gear Solid series, and possibly how the fuck do you say his name? And possibly Keiichiro Toyama from the original Silent Hill and Siren games. The idea of a developer that could be the video game equivalent of like a Wes Anderson or a Stanley Kubrick was really strange to think about for a very long period of time. But in 2005, and seemingly out of fucking nowhere, a little game came out under the Capcom logo that was spearheaded and made well known to be directed by a strange new face named Suda 51.
I'm game designer. Woo!
Immediately, this strange alias raised many eyebrows. Upon playing the game, it was discovered to be so aggressively anti-ubiquitous with conventions in game design that it turned a lot of people off. I myself got the game when it was new, and I could never get myself out of that first level. It was so against everything I had ever known to be a video game, and the obtuseness of it all made it so hard to engage with. I was intrigued, but I was unable to force myself to continue. Its controls were bizarre, the characters made seemingly no sense, the style was incredibly dynamic, the gunplay was incredibly different, the puzzles made no sense, and the direction of the game was unlike anything I had ever seen. Killer 7 is a game with such an intense vision and laser-focused direction that the fact that it came out in the year 2005 is so genuinely amazing to me that I almost cannot even put it into words. It is so ahead of its time that I think that 16 years on, I don't think we have caught up to it in terms of style. And it might single-handedly be the coolest game ever made. While Suda51 is more of a household name at this point in time due to the extravagant success of No More Heroes, when Killer 7 came out in the States, it is very likely that it was many people's first interaction with that name and his, let's say, unique vision. Which brings me to the question, how the fuck do I describe Killer 7? It is a surreal, first-person, third-person, on-rails, action-adventure, survival horror shooter. But that doesn't even come close to the full picture. Not only is the gameplay strikingly unique and diverse from even all of those previously named genres, its story also tackles some insanely powerful subjects that deal with government superpowers, mind control, the distrust of the government itself, and the trauma and guilt one can experience from performing actions that leave us scarred and traumatized. And it's all categorically unified by this cel-shaded dream world. Oh my god, this game is so fucking sick! What Suda51 does with this skeleton of a game structure is nothing short of mesmerizing. There is not one thing that resides inside of this game that does not add to the atmosphere, the style, or even just the overall sense of feeling like an intense, single-minded assassin. You walk with a certain swagger and confidence no matter what the situation is. You always mock the enemies as you kill them. The laughter of each kill of the main enemies of the game, known as the Heaven Smile, only emphasizes the sense of power that you feel as the game progresses. Even each character's reload animations make you feel like a badass. Suda51 takes so many conventional ideas and sandwiches them all into a single game, but looks at every single one of those ideas and says, nah, you know what? Fuck it! The graphics are the first thing that you immediately notice, and it stands so far and away from pretty much everything else released at that time. The only games that I can think of that even look remotely like Killer 7 from this same era are The Wind Waker and Drake of the 99 fucking Dragons. There is such an intense and focused graphical beauty going on throughout the entirety of this game, and nearly every single frame could be a poster promoting it. In a time where games were genuinely taking their first steps into trying to look real, the graphics are almost an anarchistic attempt to be different. You want realistic graphics? Fuck off! Have this insanely stylized world with incredibly stark color palettes. In hindsight, this has only benefited the game in the years lasting after its release, as pretty much every single game attempting to look real for the time have aged as well as, well, Drake of the 99 fucking Dragons. The cel-shaded world serves as a backdrop to the rest of the gameplay, as they often give you something to oogle at as you traverse the loosely puzzle box designed levels. When I said earlier that the game has survival horror elements, it comes from a lot of the game's world design. When I think of a game with survival horror mechanics, I think of a game that is based around a puzzle box. Survival horror, in my opinion, is loosely based off of the Metroidvania format. A small area of exploratory wonder that usually leaves you blocked off at many areas that eventually open up through the act of solving puzzles. The general gameplay is emphasized through restricted movement in the controls and an emphasis on somewhat tricky combat, or at least combat that makes encounters a win-or-lose situation all of the time. Killer 7 abides by these rules, put into place by legends of the survival horror genre, but as you will learn to be a common occurrence, Suda51 takes the conventions and says, "Woo!" I think first and foremost, though, we need to talk about how the game's traversal is tackled. If you aren't already familiar with Killer 7, then you might be confused upon hearing me say that the game is on rails when the game is clearly not set up like a Time Crisis or something. That's because no matter how the level you're exploring is set up and designed, there are only so many routes that you can take to complete each level. The entire mechanic of movement is, apart from 180 flipping, literally just set to the A button. You hold A, and the Smiths just go. You'll interact with specific waypoints that branch off into different pathways that you can take, but there is no way to juke the enemies in Resident Evil. You're on a straight line the whole time. I think that this simple idea is actually used to an incredibly beneficial manner because it gives Suda the freedom to make a game that feels like a puzzle box but never lets the player feel overwhelmed with too many options. You know exactly what routes you can take and exactly how far into those routes that you can go before you hit a roadblock. Even up until the last few levels of the game, the levels are never too big that needing to go back to the beginning of them for whatever reason is too much of a chore. They even managed to fit shortcuts into a lot of them. And because of this, I would actually think that if you're not really into the survival horror genre of video games, Killer 7 might be a really good entry point into them, because not only is the game not necessarily scary, but it gives such a streamlined, focused take on that format, but also literally makes every single encounter somehow feel both intense, and also gives you a sense of genuinely feeling like a badass. The audio design is blaring enough that each battle with the Heaven Smile feels empowering, but the small window of the insta-kill on each of them makes their slow, meandering walk seem banal at first, but as you progress through the game and they start to swarm you, it makes each encounter one that you sometimes barely scrape by on. I cannot think of a game that even touched on the survival horror tropes in game design that decided to also make the game a first-person shooter. Killer 7 is also generally a third-person action-adventure game with an occasionally dynamic camera system that also decides, seemingly at random, to be a fixed camera game a la the early Resident Evil games. But when necessary to kill the game's enemies, you go into a first-person viewpoint to shoot and kill. Going into first-person means that you can shoot, but the game puts a barrier between you and the Heaven Smile. Upon entering the first-person viewpoint, you'll realize that all of the enemies are just invisible. The only way that you'll know that they're even there is by hearing them laughing, in which case you'll go into the first-person viewpoint and scan to look for them. When you scan for the enemies, you'll realize that each enemy has two methods of killing them. You can either shoot at them until they explode in a glory of blood and laughter, or you can find a single yellowish spot that insta-kills them, which rewards you with a bountiful amount of blood that works not only as an equivalent to the souls from Dark Souls, I did it! I somehow found a way to mention Dark Souls! In which you can use to fill up a blood tank that are in the safe rooms that you use to help level up your character, and make their shots more powerful, give them counterattacks, and more. But even this whole level up system is stylized and refuses to be anything less than unique. The whole mechanic is set up through a TV that plays a role as a character selection and a blood bank. The blood bank collects all of the blood that you've managed to collect from killing the enemies, and there is a doctor there that just somehow radiates character. He says nothing and only operates the machine that takes the blood that you've collected, but even just the way his mannerisms are conveyed give him so much character and style. I mean, just fucking look at this guy. He's just like, just the way he holds his arms up, and it's just like, yeah, I don't give a fuck, but like, how is he this cool? How is he this cool? But you also use blood as a healing mechanic. As you take damage, you will notice that just like everything else in this game, nothing is quite normal, and your health meter is a little red eye socket in the top left of your screen. As you take damage, the eye will slowly close, but you can use some of the blood that you've gathered from killing Heaven Smile and fill the eye back up, essentially regenerating your HP. And this style doesn't stop with just the level up system or even the blood mechanic itself. Killer 7 is not only about playing as just an assassin, but as 7.
Do you get it? Because it's called Killer 7.
Killer 7's main hook is playing between 7 assassins that are all distinguishable and unique, and also shockingly balanced. Dan is the well-rounded damage dealer, Coyote can't take damage for shit but can easily one-shot a lot of the enemies, Khan is super fast and deals rapid, small damage, Kevin can turn invisible and evade enemies, Coyote can jump high distances and pick any lock in the game, Master Smith can headbutt objects that block your path, and he can tank all of the damage in the world. But I mean, my god, even just choosing a character is fucking incredible. I mean, just look at this. Suda refuses to let anything in this game be mundane, and you get an incredible amount of satisfaction just from choosing a character. And this goes two ways, because odds are you'll have a standard favorite one or two characters, and you'll generally play as them, but then when you come across a puzzle where you'll need a certain character's expertise in order to complete it, so you'll go to the character select screen, change the character, feel this incredible auditory explosion of sound as you witness the character transition, and then immediately feel the satisfaction of completing a puzzle. It's just a constant barragement of pleasure hitting the senses. And the uniqueness doesn't even stop there, as another stylistic highlight are the game's bosses. Each chapter concludes with its own boss battle, and while there is technically one repeat throughout the game, each individual boss itself is incredibly unique and is almost like its own little mini-game. I won't go over all of them for the sake of spoilers, but just to give you an inkling of what I'm talking about, there is the boss Julia Kasugi from the Sunset chapter, whose battle is essentially a Mario Party minigame of trying to spam the A button to get as many hits on her as possible before her timer runs out. It's an interesting endurance battle that is never seen again throughout the game. There's the malevolent and cruel Curtis Blackburn that plays like a cowboy standoff where the minigame is timing based around the bird on his shoulder. As incredibly tense and as sweat-inducing as this is, you can't help feel like a fucking badass on each successful attempt that you manage to get a hit on him. And not only are each of these fights unique, and not only are they unique in the genre and style of gameplay that Killer 7 is, but each one feels intense, gratifying, and satisfying to experience and complete. And I think that the last thing that I want to touch on is the game's music. I've been using it throughout the video, and despite the incredible range of styles going from just like ambient music, to industrial, to pure rock, to jazz, to metal, to classical, to Japanese styled songs, and everything else in between, there is seemingly no cohesion at all. But through that lack of coherency, there is a uniformity that makes the music of Killer 7 something entirely its own. What starts as disjointed genres and soundscapes become a unified and whole piece of music that once you have experienced Killer 7 is altogether nothing other than Killer 7. Each track fits the scenes they're associated with beautifully, and you are constantly hearing new sounds, feeling new emotions, and experiencing new connections within just the music. And I can't praise the OST enough. But enough about all this. I think you seriously just need to play the fucking thing, because trying to explain what makes Killer 7 more than the sum of its parts without having first experience with it is kinda like someone trying to explain to someone else what can make an Impossible Burger just as good as a regular burger, having never tried one. You could try to explain the flavor, explain the texture, the juiciness of it all, but until someone else tries it, they're not gonna understand how anything can come close to resembling a real burger that isn't made of real meat. Killer 7 has a story. A really fucking heavy story. But it's also a story that 16 years after its release is one that people are still debating over, because the game is layered deep in metaphor. I briefly mentioned some of the game's themes and aspects that it covers, but Killer 7 embodies what makes stories and games in the realm of what it presents to you so important, incredible, fantastic, and fun. You can argue that Killer 7 is style over substance and a lot of things, but you know what I say to that?
Fuck you!
First and foremost, the style and presentation of Killer 7 is just fun. But you know that already because you watched the first part of the video. But Killer 7's story almost transcends the game itself. Piecing together the game's narrative as the game progresses is fun because you are given just enough info and given just enough of a hanging mystery that helps keep you engaged through each level that you play through. Taking place in a alternate early 21st century, a treaty ends all international conflict and is celebrated by the destruction of all nuclear weapons outside the Earth's atmosphere in a dazzling display of fire. The explosions in the sky come to represent a symbol of world peace. Eventually, to combat terrorism, pandemics, and cyber-terrorism, the International Ethics Committee shuts down all air travel and the public's use of the internet. However, a new terrorist group going under the moniker Heaven Smile begin to appear after an attack on the United Nations, and that's essentially where the game starts. But as I said previously, the game tackles some really heavy themes, and I think Suda 51 tackled the paranoia of Western politics inside of this game so exquisitely that having played through the game and delving into post-gameplay into the story, that as an American it almost makes my skin crawl reading about some of this stuff. It hits on the edges of MK Ultra, the constant fear of terrorism, the seedy underbelly of the exploitation of children, the fraud of the government, and plays with the idea that government superpowers are forever entangled in the grips of a hunger for more power that will always lead to devastation to the people they are meant to be in charge of keeping safe. That anything will be worth the price of more power, more control, and that anything less than that just means that they haven't thrown enough life at the problem to pretend that they have that illusion of power that they crave. But that is all just the surface level narrative. And the thing about Killer 7 is that the surface level narrative is still very unusually told. I wouldn't be surprised that most people, after having beaten the game for the first time, will still not have any true reasonable understanding of what even exactly happened. But unlike a lot of the subtle themes and metaphors presented in this story, all of the beats are there in the open for you to see. It's the metaphors and symbolism that truly shine the hardest in the post-gameplay exploration of Killer 7. And to be honest, I'm not really sure I can talk about that stuff yet without pulling nonsense out of my ass, but that's what I want to talk about here. Art like Killer 7 is proof that style only adds to the substance when done correctly. When you have a game like Killer 7 that feels obtuse and scattered, but its gameplay is as satisfying as it is, then you can still engage with the story at a bare bones level and still connect with the surface level beats that occasionally will pop up and hit home with you. That's what happened to me. But when you are left wanting after the credits roll, that's the sign of something special. People seem to think that having to look up information about the story of a game or a movie after having seen it or experienced it is a bad thing. But I would argue that in the long run, it's one of the best things a story can do. It keeps you engaged long after you have sat through it all. You are left thinking and wanting, pondering theories, coming up with ideas that can tie the pieces of the puzzle in your mind, and when you sit down to talk about it with someone, that person can present something to you that you never even thought of, and that has the potential of creating new pathways in your mind to wander inside of and create even more ideas inside of them. Suda51 has single-handedly made me a fan of his work with this one game. There is a feverish need to experience all that this man has to offer. Whether it be the slight horror-tinged Shadows of the Damned, the totally similar No More Heroes, the actual horror game I'm sure can't be anything less than a masterpiece, Fatal Frame Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, and even the absolutely insane Michigan Report from Hell, because why the fuck wouldn't I want to play that game? And the thing about Suda51 is that his games are connected. In one way or another, you will see some semblance of the Smiths showing up in No More Heroes, references to the Silver Case and Flowers, Sun, and Rain inside of Killer 7, and Travis Touchdown inside Killer is Dead. In the little universe of Suda's games, everything is connected. Everything has a point. Everything works together in a strange unison that makes everything, well, everything. Suda51 is a man who thinks outside of the box, and he is someone that looks at the conventions of a game and sees what you recognize as normal, and tries to push what you will accept to its absolute limit in some cases. If Hideo Kojima is the Steven Spielberg of video games, someone known for their bombastic, huge, and yet incredibly thought-provoking movies, then Suda51 is the mainstream art house aficionado David Lynch equivalent. Funnily enough, the government in Killer 7 destroyed the internet in a vain attempt to prevent terrorism, or at least in an attempt to pretend to look like it was. But Killer 7 shines harder than it ever has because of the internet. Because of the obtuseness of the story, the gameplay, and the graphics, people keep coming back to it after all of this time to discuss it. Because that is what art is best at. Making us think, making us feel. Killer 7 is a landmark title, and Killer 7 makes you feel. Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for watching. It means a lot if you made it all the way to the end of the video. Sorry this one took so long. I hope it was worth the wait. You can find more of my stuff on my channel. Obviously, I just did a 12 days of Itchy Tasty where I go over 12 random horror games I found on itch.io, one day at a time. But I just want to say thank you again. It means a lot. And I'll see you next time.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.
But each one feels intense, gratifying. I said it again. Oh man, I gotta leave that in. But each one feels intense, gratifying. Why am I saying that?